I've been a truck driver for 15 years now. Long hauls, overnight shifts, endless roads that stretch into nothing. It's a life of solitude, just me and the engine humming under my seat. I've seen things, some strange, some disturbing, but nothing ever made me consider walking away from this job. Until one winter night on a remote road in the middle of nowhere. It was early December, cold enough that the windshield frosted over faster than the defroster could clear it. I had just picked up a load from a warehouse in Montana and was heading south through Wyoming, cutting across a 2-lane road that barely saw any traffic at this hour. The trip was supposed to be routine, drive through the night, stop for a few hours of rest, and keep moving. But things never go as planned. About 6 hours into the drive, somewhere past Casper but before Rawlins, the snow started coming down hard. My wipers fought against it, but the road was disappearing beneath a layer of ice. I checked my GPS, looking for a safe place to pull over. The next truck stop was another 80 miles out, too far to risk in these conditions. Then I saw a small wooden sign on the side of the road. Cabins, 2 miles ahead. I figured it was one of those off-the-road spots where hunters or hikers stayed, maybe a family-owned lodge. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a place to wait out the snowstorm. I slowed the rig down, took the exit, and followed a narrow road that twisted through a patch of forest. The headlights barely cut through the thick snowfall, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But then, up ahead, I spotted a cabin. It wasn't what I expected. No lights, no signs of activity, just a single dark structure sitting at the end of the road. A small parking area was cleared beside it, but there were no other vehicles. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and stepped out into the cold. My boots crunched against the fresh snow as I approached the door. The place looked abandoned. No smoke from a chimney, no footprints in the snow, but the door was slightly ajar. I knocked once, just to be sure, and when there was no response, I pushed it open. The inside smelled like old wood and dust, like it hadn't been used in years. There was a fireplace, a couple of chairs, and a cot in the corner. A single lantern sat on the table, and when I checked, it still had some oil left. I figured whoever owned this place wouldn't mind if I took shelter for a few hours. So I went back to the truck, grabbed my sleeping bag, and settled in for the night. That's when things started to feel off. At first, it was just the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard something else. A sound I couldn't place. A low creaking noise, like wood shifting under weight. I sat up, listening. The cabin was old. Maybe it was just settling. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. Something was moving outside. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it through the window. Snowflakes swirled in the beam of light, but there was nothing there. No tracks, no movement. Just an empty stretch of white leading back to my truck. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right about this place. I lay back down, telling myself I was imagining things, but sleep wouldn't come. The storm had eased up a little, and the silence outside felt heavier than before, like something was waiting. Then I heard it again, not outside, inside, a slow, deliberate creak of wood. I turned my head toward the doorway. The cabin only had one entrance, and I had latched it when I came in. But now it was open, not fully, just enough that the darkness outside bled into the room. I reached for my flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard anything but that slow, creeping noise. I shone the light toward the door. Nothing, just the empty threshold leading into the storm. But I knew I had closed that door. The cold that rushed in was enough to make me shiver, but that wasn't what sent a wave of dread through my gut. It was the fact that the latch was still locked. The door hadn't been opened normally. It had been forced. My instinct told me to leave, grab my things, get in the truck, and go. but part of me was afraid to step outside, afraid of what might be waiting just beyond the reach of the light. I had to be sure. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the door, my breath fogged in the cold air as I leaned out, scanning the snow. Still nothing. No footprints, no sign of movement. But then, a sound from behind me, inside the cabin. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room. The cot was empty. The chairs were untouched, but something had moved. I was sure of it. Then I saw it. The lantern. It wasn't on the table anymore. It was on the floor. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Something had been in here with me, or maybe it still was. I took a slow step back toward the door. My hands were shaking, my throat dry. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. If there was someone in here with me, they were waiting, watching. I took another step back, then another. Then, without turning my back to the room, I reached for the door handle and pulled it shut. The second it clicked into place, I bolted. I ran through the snow, straight to my truck, my boots slipping on the ice. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. The second I was inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and threw it into reverse. The tires spun for a moment before catching traction, and then I was out of there, speeding back toward the main road. As I pulled away, I glanced in the side mirror. For just a second, in the faint glow of my taillights, I saw movement. A figure standing at the cabin's doorway, not moving, just watching. I didn't stop. I didn't even breathe until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was in that cabin, but I know one thing. I wasn't supposed to be there, and whatever was inside never left. It was the kind of rain that didn't let up. A steady, cold downpour that soaked the earth and made every step heavier. I had been out in the woods for nearly a week, building a cabin in a remote part of France. The land belonged to an old friend who had inherited it from his grandfather. He planned to turn it into a hunting lodge, and I had agreed to help get the foundation and frame set before winter. The nearest town was over an hour's drive away, and the closest neighbor was miles down the road. The isolation didn't bother me. I had spent plenty of time in places like this, deep in the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional distant sound of wildlife. Out here, there were no streetlights, no traffic, no voices, just the wind through the trees and the rhythmic tapping of rain on the unfinished roof. I had a small campsite set up next to the half-built cabin. A tent, a fire pit, a cooler, and a few supplies. Most of my tools were under a tarp near the construction site. It was slow work in the rain, but I had made decent progress. The walls were up and the framework for the roof was in place. Another few weeks and it would start looking like a real cabin. That night I was exhausted. My arms ached from hauling wood and hammering nails all day. I sat by the fire, eating a cold meal from a can, watching the flames dance against the darkness. The rain had eased up slightly, now more of a drizzle, but the ground was still slick with mud. My boots were caked in it, and my clothes were damp despite my rain jacket. It was getting late, and the wind had started to pick up. I decided to call it a night. The tent wasn't the most comfortable place to sleep, but it was better than nothing. I crawled inside, zipped up the entrance, and lay back on my sleeping bag. The sound of rain tapping against the fabric was oddly soothing. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent. Something had pulled me from my sleep, but I wasn't sure what. I listened, holding my breath. The rain had picked up again, steady and unrelenting, but beneath it, I thought I heard something else. Faint, rhythmic sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting the trees, but as I listened closer, I realized it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the wet grass and mud. I felt my pulse quicken. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. No one else had any business on this land, especially not in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm. I reached for the flashlight next to me, but I hesitated before turning it on. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my exact position just yet. Instead, I sat up quietly, straining my ears. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, barely breathing. The rain drummed against the tent, masking any subtle noises. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just an animal moving through the brush. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate step, then another. Whoever it was, they were moving carefully, trying not to be heard. I felt my stomach tighten. I wasn't unarmed. I had a hatchet near the fire pit and a hunting knife in my pack, but that didn't make me feel any better. I reached out slowly, unzipping the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned low, casting faint embers into the night. The woods were nothing but black silhouettes against the stormy sky. I couldn't see anyone. I stayed like that for a while, watching, listening. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain kept falling, but nothing moved. No more footsteps. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I zipped the tent back up, lay down, and forced myself to relax. Then something brushed against the fabric. It was a light touch, just enough to make the material shift. My whole body tensed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Whoever was out there was right next to my tent. A long moment passed, then another. The rain pounded down, masking everything, but I could feel the presence just outside. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I lay there, every muscle in my body locked in place, waiting. Minutes passed, then an hour. The rain never stopped, and neither did my racing thoughts. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was barely beginning to rise, casting a dull gray light over the clearing. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground soaked and muddy. I sat up slowly, my body stiff and sore. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe the rain and the wind had played tricks on my mind. Then I saw the footprints. Deep, muddy imprints circled my tent, leading toward the half-built cabin. The steps were deliberate, measured. Not the erratic movements of an animal, but the careful pacing of someone walking, watching. I stood up, scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. Whoever had been there was gone. I grabbed my knife and followed the tracks cautiously. They led from my tent to the cabin, then back toward the woods, disappearing into the underbrush. I didn't know who had been out there or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone in those woods. I spent the next few hours packing my gear. I wasn't going to stick around to find out if they planned on coming back. The cabin would have to wait. By noon, I was in my truck, driving down the muddy road that led back to town. I didn't look back. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to be around when it decided to come back. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the blood on my hands. The wind outside howled against the thin walls of the cabin, pushing the cold into every crack. My body shivered, but it wasn't from the cold. It was from something else, something worse. The kind of fear that doesn't go away. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't mean to be here at all. It started a few days ago, out on the highway. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, cutting across the state on my way to visit an old friend. The roads were empty, the kind of quiet stretch where you don't see another car for miles. The only thing out there was the trees, stretching endlessly in every direction, swallowing the road like it didn't belong. The kind of place where you could disappear and no one would ever find you. That should have been my first warning. The gas light flickered on, and I cursed under my breath. I'd been so focused on getting through the long stretch of road that I hadn't stopped to refuel. There was no sign of a station, and my map wasn't showing much of anything out here. But I knew there had to be something. A little farther down, I spotted a turnoff. A cracked wooden sign barely stood on the side of the road, its letters worn down by time. Miller's Outpost, 7 miles. It didn't sound like a gas station, but at this point, I didn't care. I needed fuel. The road off the highway was worse. Potholes deep enough to snap an axle, loose gravel kicking up against the undercarriage. It wound through dense trees, deeper and deeper into nothingness. The sun had started to dip behind the hills, painting the sky in streaks of dull orange. Finally, I saw it. A small collection of buildings barely standing. A gas pump sat in front of a little shop, its paint long since peeled away. I pulled up and killed the engine, hoping there was still something left in the old pump. As I stepped out, I noticed how quiet it was. Not just normal quiet. Too quiet, No birds, no wind, just stillness. Felt wrong. I walked into the shop. A bell jingled, but nobody was inside. Shelves were mostly empty, a thick layer of dust covering what was left. Behind the counter, a small door led to a back room, and I could hear something back there. Faint, but moving. I should have left. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the stubborn thought that I'd already come this far. But I knocked on the counter. The door opened. A man stepped out, his eyes sharp and cold. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked like he was expecting me. His uniform told me everything I needed to know. A sheriff's badge, old and scratched up, sat on his chest. But there was something off about it. The nameplate was missing. His belt had no radio. Something was wrong. He looked me up and down before finally speaking. "Need gas?" I nodded. He didn't say anything else, just walked past me. Stepping outside, I followed. He grabbed a can from the back of an old truck, poured some into my tank, and watched me the whole time. His expression never changed. Then he spoke again. "You should leave." I didn't argue. I pulled a few bills from my pocket, but he didn't take them. He just turned and walked back toward the building. I got in my car and drove. I told myself I was fine, that I was overthinking it, that the guy was just some backwoods sheriff with a bad attitude. But then I saw the headlights. They appeared in my rear view way too close. A blacked-out SUV, speeding up behind me, pushing faster. I pressed down on the gas. The road was rough, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to the highway. Then the sirens came. I gritted my teeth. There was no way this was normal. The gas station, the sheriff, the look in his eyes. This wasn't some routine stop. This was something else. I didn't stop. I hit the turn, back onto the main road, tires skidding against the pavement. The SUV followed. The sirens blared louder. The lights flashed, but there was no radio call, no backup. Just them. I pushed the speed higher, but the road twisted sharply, and I felt the tires slip. I tried to regain control, but the car spun, sliding off the pavement. The last thing I saw was trees rushing toward me. Then darkness. I woke up to the smell of damp wood. My head ached. My body felt heavy. The room was dim, lit by a single lantern on a wooden table. The air was thick with the scent of pine and old dust. I was in a cabin. My car was gone. My phone was gone. And I wasn't alone. The sheriff sat in a chair across from me. Another man stood by the door, dressed the same, badge just as worn. There were no words. I knew what this was. They didn't bring me here to help me. They brought me here because I saw something I wasn't supposed to. I tried to move, but my body was weak. My hands were tied. The sheriff leaned forward. resting his arms on his knees, staring at me like I was already dead. I don't remember how long I sat there. My head spun, my vision blurred. They didn't speak. They didn't ask questions. They just waited. And then the door opened. Another man walked in. His face was familiar. It was the man from the gas station. But now I understood. He wasn't just some old shopkeeper. He was one of them, and he was here to finish it. I don't know how I got out. I don't remember breaking the chair, or the struggle, or the moment my hands closed around something sharp. But I remember the blood. I remember the weight of his body, the way he gasped as I pushed the blade deeper. I remember running. The forest was endless. My body ached. My breath came in ragged bursts. I didn't stop. I didn't turn back. I ran until my legs gave out. And when I finally reached the highway, when I finally saw headlights in the distance, I collapsed onto the road. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital. They told me they found a cabin. They told me about the bodies. They told me the sheriff didn't exist. No records, no department, nothing. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I know they weren't the only ones out there. Because some nights, when the road is empty and the trees are too quiet, I see headlights in the distance. And I keep driving, because I know if I stop, they'll be waiting. I had been driving for hours when I realized I was lost. The road was dark, twisting through thick trees that swallowed the last bit of daylight. My phone had lost signal long ago, and my fuel gauge was dipping lower than I was comfortable with. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere off the main highway, trying to take a shortcut, and now I was deep in unfamiliar territory. The rain had started about an hour ago, light at first, then turning into a steady downpour that made the road slick. I slowed down as I spotted something through the trees. A cabin, just barely visible through the rain. There was no sign of other cars, no mailbox, no paved driveway, but the place looked lived in. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. A single porch light glowed against the darkness. I didn't want to stop. Everything in me told me to keep going, to turn around, to figure something else out. But I had no other choice. My fuel light had come on, and the last gas station had been over an hour back. If I didn't stop, I'd end up stranded in the middle of nowhere. I pulled up to the edge of the driveway, my tires crunching over the gravel. The rain was heavy now, pounding against my windshield, and the wipers barely kept up. I shut the engine off and sat there for a moment, debating. The house was dark except for that one porch light. I didn't see movement inside. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the rain, jogging up the short path to the front door. I knocked hard 3 times, then waited. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I hesitated, then tried the doorknob. To my surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing the inside of the cabin warm, dimly lit by a fire in the stone fireplace. The place smelled like wood smoke and damp earth, with a faint metallic scent underneath. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely carrying over the rain hammering the roof. Silence. The cabin was simple. One large room with a small kitchen in the corner, a wooden table with mismatched chairs, and a couch near the fire. A doorway led to what I assumed was a bedroom. There was no TV, no modern appliances. It felt old, like it had been there for decades. I stepped inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor. My boots left muddy prints as I moved. Something about the place felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. There was a mug on the table, half full of something dark. A plate sat beside it, crumbs still on the surface. Someone had been here. I called out again. Still no answer. I turned to leave, deciding I'd rather take my chances sleeping in my car. But just as I reached for the door, I heard something, a noise from the back of the cabin. A slow, dragging sound. I froze. My heart pounded. Came again, closer this time. Something moving in the next room. I clicked off my flashlight and stepped back into the shadows, pressing myself against the wall. The door to the back room was slightly ajar, and through the small opening, I saw movement. A figure, a man, hunched over, dragging something across the floor. Couldn't breathe. I could barely see, but the shape of him was wrong. His posture unnatural, his shoulders too high, his head tilted at an angle that made my skin crawl. He was carrying something heavy, something limp. I knew then that I had made a mistake. I backed toward the door as slowly as I could, keeping my footsteps light. The rain covered most of the noise, but the floorboards creaked beneath me. The man stopped. The dragging sound stopped. I held my breath. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of the rain. Then footsteps, fast, coming toward me. I turned and ran. I hit the door, shoving it open so hard it slammed against the wall. I bolted through the rain, slipping on the wet gravel, my boots sliding as I scrambled for my car. I yanked the door open and dove inside, fumbling for the keys. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip them. Then, in the glow of my headlights, I saw him. He was standing on the porch, staring at me. His clothes were soaked in something dark, his hands hanging at his sides. His head was tilted, like he was trying to decide something. I turned the key. The engine sputtered. "No, no, no," I whispered. The man took a step forward. The engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the mud, before slamming it into drive and tearing down the road. My heart was slamming so hard in my chest I thought I might pass out. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The road twisted and turned, the rain making it impossible to see, but I kept going. My hands were locked onto the wheel. My pulse thundered in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I never reported it. I never told anyone. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know one thing. That cabin wasn't abandoned, and I wasn't supposed to be there. I had been looking for a quiet place to spend a week alone, something deep in the woods, away from the noise and routines of my life. I wasn't the kind of person who liked being around too many people for too long. I didn't mind it for work or when necessary, but I had always found comfort in silence. I liked the idea of having time to myself, away from everything. I had taken trips before, usually hiking or camping, but this time, I wanted something a little more solid than just a tent. I found a small, old cabin for rent deep in the forests of Wyoming. It was one of those places you wouldn't find unless you were specifically looking for it. The listing was basic, no fancy descriptions, no overly edited pictures. Just a simple wooden structure surrounded by thick trees with a small clearing out front. The owner was an old man who lived in town, about 40 miles from the cabin. He told me the place was rarely rented out anymore, mostly because people didn't want to go that far off-grid. There was no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, an outhouse, and a creek nearby for water. That was fine by me. I had no problem with isolation. In fact, that was exactly what I wanted. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my truck on the narrow dirt path that led up to the cabin. The drive had been rough. Unpaved roads that twisted and turned through the forest, with barely enough space for a vehicle. If someone was coming the other way, one of us would have had to back up a long way. But there hadn't been anyone else. I hadn't seen another person for miles, which was exactly what I wanted. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but sturdy. The wood was old and dark, the roof covered in moss, but it held together well. There was a small porch with a single rocking chair, its paint long faded and peeling. The windows were dusty, but they weren't broken. Inside, it was as simple as it could be. A single room with a bed against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a small table with 2 chairs. A shelf on the far side held a few old pots and pans, probably left behind by past renters. There were no decorations, no signs that anyone had lived here for a long time. Just the basics. I unpacked my things, stacking my food supplies in a corner and setting my sleeping bag on the bed. I had brought everything I needed: canned food, bottled water, a rifle, extra ammunition, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a few books to pass the time. I wasn't planning on doing much except relaxing, hiking a little during the day, maybe some small game hunting. Nothing serious, just time away from everything. The first night was quiet, the kind of silence you only get in places far from civilization. No distant cars, no voices, no hum of power lines. Just the occasional sound of the wind moving through the trees and the faint rustling of small animals outside. It was peaceful. I slept without trouble. The second day, I went for a long hike, following a barely visible game trail through the woods. The air was crisp, cool, but not cold. I saw deer tracks, signs of small animals, even what looked like an old bear print near the creek, though it wasn't fresh. I didn't see any large animals, just birds and a few squirrels. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees, stretching long shadows across the clearing. I ate, sat on the porch for a while, and then went to bed. It was the third night that things started to feel different. I woke up in the middle of the night for no reason that I could tell. It wasn't a sound that woke me, at least not one I could remember hearing. It was just a feeling, the kind you get when something isn't right, when something is off. The cabin was completely silent. Even outside, there was no noise. Not the wind, not the chirping of insects, nothing. Just complete, unnatural silence. I lay there for a moment, listening, trying to figure out what had changed. Then I heard it, something moving outside. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't small either. It wasn't the sound of a squirrel or a raccoon. It was heavier, slow, deliberate. Footsteps, but not quite. There was something strange about them, something off. Too light for a bear, too irregular for a deer. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tight as I sat up. The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening, but I didn't hear anything else. After a while, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had just been a deer passing through. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. Eventually, I fell asleep again. The next day, I walked around the cabin, looking for any signs of what might have been out there. I found tracks near the trees, but they were strange. They looked like deer tracks at first, but something was wrong with them. The shape was slightly off, like they had been made by something trying to imitate a deer's hooves but not quite getting it right. Some were too long, others too wide, and they didn't move in a normal pattern. They circled the cabin, stopping near the porch before leading back into the trees. I didn't like it. I spent most of the day close to the cabin, keeping my rifle nearby. I didn't go for a hike. I didn't want to. There was an unease in the air, something I couldn't quite explain. That night, I locked the door and kept the rifle next to my bed. The sounds came back. This time, they were closer, not just near the trees, but right outside the cabin. I could hear something brushing against the wood, moving around the porch. Then, the worst part, something tapping against the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just gripped the rifle and stayed as still as I could. The tapping was slow, deliberate, like it knew I was inside, like it was trying to get my attention. Then it stopped. Silence again. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found more tracks. This time, they were different. They weren't deer tracks anymore. They were human. Bare feet, but elongated, the toes too long, the shape slightly wrong. They led from the trees to the porch and then back into the woods. I packed my things. I didn't care if I had paid for the whole week. I wasn't staying. I loaded everything into my truck and started driving, forcing my way down the narrow dirt road as fast as I could. The whole time, I kept looking in the mirrors, expecting to see something behind me. I didn't. I made it back to town and returned the keys to the old man. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't want to talk about it. He just nodded like he understood. I never went back. I never tried to find out what it was. Some things are better left alone. I never thought I'd end up spending a night in a cabin by a graveyard. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be out there, alone, in a rundown place surrounded by the dead, I would have laughed. But life has a way of throwing things at you, and sometimes you don't get to say no. It started when I lost my job. I had worked construction for years, and it wasn't anything special, but it paid the bills. Then the company shut down, and I found myself scrambling for work. A buddy of mine knew a guy who owned a bunch of land way out in the country, including a small cabin. The guy had been trying to sell the place for a while, but no one wanted to buy land that had an abandoned graveyard on it. I figured I'd take the job, stay out there for a few nights, fix up the place, and earn some cash. It wasn't like I had many options. The land was about an hour from the nearest town. The drive was long, the roads were empty, and the closer I got, the more I started to understand why no one wanted this place. The trees were thick, pressing in on both sides of the road. The sky was gray, the kind of dull color that makes everything look dead. When I finally pulled up, the cabin was worse than I expected. It sat at the edge of the property, maybe 30 yards from the graveyard. The wood was rotting, the windows were dusty, and the front porch sagged. I killed the engine, got out, and stretched, listening to the silence around me. The graveyard wasn't big. A few dozen tombstones, most of them leaning, covered in moss. Some had cracked in half. The fence around it was rusted, barely standing in places. I figured it was old, maybe 100, maybe 200 years. The air smelled damp, like wet leaves and dirt. I grabbed my bag and tools, walked up to the cabin, and pushed the door open. The inside was just as bad. Dust hung in the air, and the wooden floor creaked under my boots. There was an old bed frame in the corner, a small table, and a broken chair. The fireplace was filled with ashes from whoever had stayed there last. I didn't waste time. I got to work cleaning up, patching holes in the walls, fixing the door. It was late afternoon by the time I finished most of it. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. That's when I started feeling off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like someone was watching me. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. I made a quick dinner, canned beans and bread, then sat on the porch looking out at the graveyard. The air had gotten colder. The trees barely moved. The only sound was the wind pushing through the grass. I don't know when I noticed it, but at some point, I realized something was off with the graveyard. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The stones all looked the same, leaning and covered in moss. But the longer I stared, the more I was sure one of them had moved. I stood up, rubbing my arms against the chill. Maybe it was just the light changing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the graveyard didn't look the same as when I first arrived. I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight, walked down the steps, and made my way toward the rusted fence. The ground was soft, my boots sinking slightly into the dirt. I stopped at the fence, gripping the cold metal, and shined the light over the stones. Nothing, just the same broken, weathered tombstones. The names had worn away on most of them. Some had dates from the 1800s. My breath was visible in the air now, even though it hadn't been that cold earlier. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. Footprints. Not mine. The ground was damp, soft enough to hold the shape of a boot. But these prints weren't facing the way I had come. They were leading toward the cabin. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the trees, the grass, the edge of the property. Nothing. The prints were fresh. I turned and walked back, slow and steady, scanning the area around me. My heartbeat was heavy in my ears. When I reached the porch, I stopped and looked down. There were more footprints. They led right up to the door. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and shut it behind me. My hand hovered over the lock for a second before I turned it. The air inside felt colder than before. My breath came out in short bursts. I set the flashlight on the table, grabbed my hammer from the tool bag, and sat on the bed, listening. Silence. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I had just missed the footprints earlier. Maybe they were old, from someone else who had been here before me. I lay down after a while, fully clothed, boots on, hammer still in my grip. I shut my eyes and tried to slow my breathing. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The cabin was pitch black. My fingers tightened around the hammer. I listened. The wind outside had stopped. The air felt thick, like the world was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a sound from outside, a single, slow footstep on the porch. My chest tightened. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the hammer so hard my knuckles ached. Another step, closer to the door. The doorknob rattled. I sat up, every muscle in my body tensed. The lock held. Silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, staring at the door. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept in through the cracks in the walls. I didn't sleep again. When the sun was fully up, I opened the door. The footprints were still there, more of them now circling the cabin. They weren't mine. I packed my things, got in my truck, and left without looking back. The guy who owned the land asked if I had finished the repairs. I lied and said I had. I never told him what happened. Never told anyone. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't ever want to find out. It was late October when I took the job. The air was damp. The leaves on the trees were already thinning, and the roads in this part of northern England were always slick with rain. I wasn't looking for anything special, just work. Something to keep me busy, keep me out of my head. A friend of mine, Adam, had lined me up with a property maintenance job. The owner, an older man named Richard, had inherited a cabin up in the hills from his brother, but didn't have the time or the energy to keep up with repairs. It was secluded, no neighbors, no main road, just miles of trees and muddy tracks. Perfect if you wanted peace or if you wanted to be forgotten. I didn't ask many questions. I never do. I needed the money, and I liked the idea of being out there with nothing but the sound of rain on the roof. I packed my truck with tools, food, and enough supplies to last me a week. The drive took nearly 2 hours, most of it on winding roads that cut through empty fields and thick woodland. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low. The place looked worse than I expected. The roof sagged, the windows were thick with grime, and the front porch had started to rot. But the inside was decent, dusty but livable. A wood-burning stove, an old iron bed frame, and a kitchen that smelled like damp wood. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tools, lit a fire, and sat in the quiet. No phone service. No electricity apart from a generator out back, which I left off to save fuel. Just the sound of the wind and the occasional patter of rain. But the second night, I noticed something strange. I had been outside, checking the woodpile, when I saw movement near the tree line. At first, I thought it was an animal. A deer, maybe. But then I saw the shape of a person. A woman, standing completely still, half hidden in the trees. She was tall, thin, and wrapped in something dark. A long coat, maybe. Her face was pale, barely visible in the dim light. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. I'm not the kind of person who gets spooked easily, but something about the way she stood, motionless, almost unnatural, made my stomach turn. I took a step forward, squinting through the rain, but as soon as I moved, she turned and slipped back into the woods. I didn't chase her. I went inside, locked the door, and sat by the fire, trying to make sense of it. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she lived nearby and was just curious about the cabin. But there were no houses for miles, and something about the way she stood there, staring, made it feel like she wasn't lost at all. The next morning, I walked down to the edge of the woods.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. I told myself I had imagined it, just a trick of the light. But that night, she came back. I was inside, cleaning up after dinner, when I heard something outside, a soft rustling, like someone shifting their weight on the wet ground. I stood still, listening, heart pounding. Then, a shadow passed by the window, slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The shadow disappeared, but I knew she was still there, standing just outside the cabin, watching. I grabbed my flashlight and threw open the door, shining the beam into the dark. Nothing. No movement, no footprints. Just the wind through the trees and the slow drip of rain off the roof. I slept with my knife under my pillow that night. The next day, I considered leaving, but I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let some strange woman scare me off. Maybe she was homeless. Maybe she was just some local who didn't like me being there. Either way, I wasn't leaving. That evening, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I brought in extra firewood, checked the windows, and sat with my back to the wall. The night stretched on, long and silent. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The fire was still burning low. The room was warm. But then I heard it. Breathing. Not mine. Slow, shallow breaths. Just outside the cabin. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound was close, just beyond the door. Then came the softest tap. Not a knock, just a single, careful tap. Like she was letting me know she was there. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. And then, after what felt like forever, the breathing stopped. The tap never came again. I sat awake until dawn, gripping my knife, staring at the door. When the sun finally rose, I went outside. The ground was wet, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew. I packed up my things that morning. I didn't care about finishing the job. I just wanted out. As I loaded my truck, I glanced back at the tree line. She was there, standing in the same spot as before, half hidden in the shadows. Watching. I didn't stop. I didn't hesitate. I climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back again. By the time I reached town, I had convinced myself that it didn't matter, that it was just some local woman, someone who had lived near the cabin for years and didn't like outsiders. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear it. That soft, deliberate tap, like she never really left, like she's still out there, waiting. I never wanted to be out there, not really. But when my boss asked me to check on his cabin while he was away, I didn't have much of a choice. It was one of those things where saying no wasn't really an option. I worked for a small construction company, and my boss, Mark, had this old hunting cabin deep in the woods, about an hour outside of town. He liked to go there on weekends to get away, do some hunting, and drink without anyone bothering him. He'd owned the place for years, but lately he hadn't had much time to go out there, so he wanted someone to check on it. Make sure no one had broken in, no animals had wrecked the place, that kind of thing. I was supposed to drive up there, spend the night, and report back. I didn't think it would be a big deal. I figured I'd get in, look around, and head back first thing in the morning. Just a quick trip, easy money. But the moment I turned off the highway and onto that old dirt road leading to the cabin, I knew I'd made a mistake. The road was rough, barely more than a trail cut through the trees. It was late in the afternoon, and the sky was getting dark fast. The forest on either side of me felt endless, the trees thick and close together, blocking out most of the light. The deeper I drove, the worse the road got. Potholes, rocks, branches that scraped against the side of my truck. I hadn't been out there before, and it didn't take long for me to feel completely alone. No houses, no signs of people, just trees and silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on you, heavy and unnatural. Even the usual sounds of the woods, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, seemed distant, like they were coming from far away. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was almost gone. The place was small, just a single-room structure with a porch out front and a shed off to the side. It looked run down, the wood dark and weathered, the roof sagging a little. It was clear no one had been there in a while. I parked and got out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was cool, and the smell of damp earth and pine filled my lungs. I walked up to the porch and tried the door. It was locked, just like Mark had said it would be. He'd given me a key, so I unlocked it and stepped inside. The inside was exactly what you'd expect. A small wood stove in the corner, a cot against one wall, a table with a couple of chairs. There were some old hunting magazines stacked on the table, a couple of empty beer bottles on a shelf. A thick layer of dust covered everything. I set my bag down and took a look around. There was a single window on the far wall, a tiny bathroom with an old toilet that didn't work, and a back door that led out to the woods. Everything seemed fine. No signs of a break-in, no animal damage, nothing unusual. I should have left then, but it was already dark, and I didn't like the idea of driving back down that awful road at night. So I decided to stay just like Mark had asked. I made myself as comfortable as I could, setting up my sleeping bag on the cot. I ate a granola bar, drank some water, and sat on the porch for a while, listening to the quiet. That's when I heard it. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice at first. A sound coming from somewhere in the woods. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. A branch snapping, then another. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I froze, listening. My heart was pounding. The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was just tired. I went back inside and locked the door. I told myself everything was fine. But then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again. Closer this time. A soft, dragging sound, like something being pulled through the dirt. Then another snap. Someone was out there. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and steady, circling. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window. I shined the light outside, sweeping it across the trees. Nothing, just darkness. I told myself I was being paranoid, but then something moved, a shadow just at the edge of the trees. I couldn't see what it was, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too still. I shut off the flashlight. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, gripping my knife, listening. The sounds didn't stop. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The hours dragged by, the longest night of my life. And then, just before dawn, silence. Whatever had been out there was gone. I didn't waste any time. As soon as the sun came up, I grabbed my bag and got the hell out of there. The drive back felt longer than before, the trees pressing in on me. When I finally made it back to town, I went straight to Mark's office. I told him what had happened. He just looked at me, and then he said something that chilled me to the bone. You're not the first one to hear it. I quit that job a week later. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't ever want to find out. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back to that cabin. It was a late September evening when I found myself driving through the back roads of northern Wisconsin. The air had the first real bite of autumn, crisp and carrying the scent of damp earth and dying leaves. The road was empty except for me, stretching out in winding curves between dense forests of pine and oak. It was the kind of place where civilization felt distant, the occasional mailbox the only sign that someone might live nearby. I hadn't been up this way in years. My cousin, Eric, used to own a cabin out here, tucked deep into the woods off a dirt path barely wide enough for a truck. He had loved the solitude, the hunting, the fishing, everything about being far from town. But that was years ago. Eric had been gone for almost a decade now, and his cabin had been abandoned since. I hadn't thought much about it until today, when I found myself driving past the old turnoff, seeing the overgrown path barely visible between the trees. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was nostalgia. Either way, I pulled over, the crunch of gravel under my tires loud in the quiet evening air. I sat there for a long moment, staring down that path, the woods dark and dense on either side. I shouldn't have gone in. The dirt road was in worse shape than I expected, ruts deep enough to jolt my truck as I eased my way forward. Branches scraped the sides, and overgrown weeds slapped against the doors. The last time I had been here, Eric was still alive, standing on the porch with a beer in his hand, grinning like always. That felt like another lifetime. After a slow, careful drive, I finally saw it, the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, its weathered wood darkened with age and neglect. The roof sagged a little, and the porch steps were half-rotten, one of them completely collapsed. The windows, once shining with the warm glow of lamplight, were now empty and dark. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs after the drive. The silence out here was different. Not the peaceful quiet I remembered, but heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. Even the wind barely stirred the leaves. I walked up the steps carefully, testing each one before putting my full weight down. The porch groaned under me. The door was unlocked. Of course it was. No one had lived here in years. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and old wood. The furniture was still there, covered in a fine layer of grime. The kitchen table, the couch, the old wood stove in the corner. It was like stepping into a frozen moment in time. I ran my fingers along the counter, leaving a clean streak in the dust. I had spent weekends here as a kid, fishing with Eric, sitting by the fire, listening to the sounds of the woods at night. It had always felt safe. Not anymore. There was something wrong. Not something I could see, but something I could feel. A tension in the air, an unease crawling up my spine. It was colder in here than it should have been, even with the autumn chill. I moved through the cabin slowly, my footsteps muffled by the worn rug. In the back, Eric's old bedroom was just as he had left it. Clothes still in the dresser, boots by the door, his hunting rifle mounted on the wall. It was eerie how untouched everything was. Then I noticed the tracks. Faint, but they're disturbances in the dust. Not mine. They were smaller, more scattered, like someone had been moving through here recently. My stomach tightened. I listened. Nothing but my own breathing. The rational part of me said it was probably an animal, a raccoon or maybe a stray dog looking for shelter. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I backed out of the room, careful where I stepped. My truck was outside. I could just leave, pretend I never stopped here. But then I heard it, a sound from the back of the cabin, a soft creak like a footstep. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't alone. I moved quickly, stepping as lightly as I could toward the front door. My hands felt clammy, my breath coming too fast. Then another sound, closer this time. I didn't look. I didn't want to see. I hit the porch steps in 2 strides, nearly slipping as the rotted wood gave under my foot. I caught myself and sprinted to the truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the darkness as I threw it into reverse, tearing out of there faster than I should have. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My heart still hammered in my chest, my body buzzing with adrenaline. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing but empty road behind me, the woods dark and still. I told myself it had been my imagination, that I had spooked myself, let old memories twist into something worse. But I knew better. Someone had been in that cabin, and they had been watching me the whole time. I still remember the cold bite of that November wind, the way it cut through my jacket and made my breath come out in thick, white clouds. The sun had already started sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. I had driven nearly 4 hours to get here, deep into the northern woods, where cell service was spotty, and the roads turned from pavement to dirt long before I reached the cabin. This place belonged to an old friend of my father's, a man named Gary who had passed away years ago. He and my dad used to hunt up here every season, tracking deer and elk through these dense forests. After Gary's death, his son had let the cabin sit unused, untouched by anyone except the occasional hunter willing to pay for a weekend out in the middle of nowhere. I had called in a favor, managed to get the keys, and now I stood in front of the small wooden structure, my boots crunching against the ice-crusted snow as I stepped onto the porch. The cabin was old, built from thick logs that had darkened over time, giving it a weathered look. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the windows were streaked with dirt. It had been a long time since anyone had stayed here for more than a night. I could tell. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and aged wood. I clicked on my flashlight and swept it around the room. A single bed sat against the far wall, covered in an old, moth-eaten blanket. There was a wood stove in the corner, its metal sides rusted with time, and a small kitchen area with a sink that I knew wouldn't work. Gary had never gotten around to fixing the pipes before he passed. I set my rifle against the wall and dropped my bag onto the floor. I'd brought enough supplies to last a few days. Canned food, bottled water, a small propane heater to keep from freezing if the temperature dropped too low at night. The plan was simple: spend a couple of days hunting, maybe longer if I got lucky and found a good spot. As I started unpacking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the cabin felt off. Not in a supernatural way, but in the way that tells you someone's been here before you. I noticed a few small things. Scuff marks on the floor, as if a heavy boot had dragged across the wood, and the way the blanket on the bed was rumpled, like someone had sat on it recently. I brushed it off. Could have been anyone. Other hunters used this place. Maybe someone had stayed here a night or two and left in a hurry. I locked the door behind me and got a fire going in the wood stove. The warmth spread through the cabin, making the shadows dance along the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like something alive. That first night, I slept lightly, waking up every hour or so to the sound of the wind or the occasional creak of the old wooden walls settling. I wasn't scared, but I was uneasy, like my body knew something that my mind hadn't caught on to yet. The next morning, I set out before dawn, my rifle slung over my shoulder, my breath coming out in thick clouds as I hiked deeper into the woods. The fresh snow made tracking easy. I found deer prints within the first hour and followed them for miles, moving carefully, staying quiet. But as I walked, I started noticing something strange. There were other tracks, human ones. At first, I figured it was another hunter, but the more I looked, the more it didn't add up. These prints weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Maybe a day or two at most. They weaved in and out of the deer tracks, as if whoever had made them had been following the same trail I was. And then I noticed something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The footprints stopped, not in the way that someone would turn around or step off the path. They just ended. No sign of backtracking, no broken branches leading away, just a set of footprints in the snow that led nowhere. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I forced myself to move on. Maybe the wind had just covered the rest of the tracks. Maybe the person had stepped onto a rock or somewhere I couldn't see their prints anymore. I kept going. By noon, I hadn't seen a single deer. No movement, no sound, nothing. The forest was too quiet. Normally, even in the dead of winter, you'd hear something. The rustle of birds in the trees, the distant snap of a branch as an animal moved through the brush. But today, there was only silence. I gave up by late afternoon and started heading back toward the cabin. I took a different route, hoping to spot some fresh tracks, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of trees and the thickening clouds overhead. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the temperature had dropped. The wind had picked up again, rattling the bare branches against each other like dry bones. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was irrational. I was alone out here. I knew that. But every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just outside the cabin, just beyond the glow of the fire. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. It was still dark. The fire had burned low, filling the cabin with flickering orange shadows. And then I heard it, a single footstep, not inside the cabin, outside. I held my breath, listening. The wind howled against the roof, but beneath it, I swore I heard something else. Movement, slow, deliberate. I reached for my rifle. My fingers closed around the cold metal as I eased myself out of bed. My boots barely made a sound as I stepped toward the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear. Silence, and then a long, slow scrape against the porch. I lifted the rifle, my heart hammering in my chest. Whoever was out there, they weren't trying to hide. I took a deep breath, then yanked the door open. Nothing. The porch was empty. The snow beyond it was untouched except for a single set of footprints. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I followed them with my eyes, but the darkness swallowed them up before I could see where they ended. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made my decision. I packed my things, loaded my rifle, and started the long walk back to my truck. I didn't stop to check for fresh tracks. I didn't look back at the cabin. I just walked, my breath coming out in short bursts, my ears straining for any sound behind me. I reached my truck just as the sun broke over the treetops. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and peeled out of there, kicking up snow and dirt as I sped down the narrow road. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I got a call from the guy who had let me use it. He asked how the trip went, and I lied, told him it was fine. Then I asked him something that had been eating at me since I left. When was the last time someone stayed there? He hesitated. Not sure, he said. Not for a few years, at least. I didn't say anything. I just thanked him and hung up. But I knew he was wrong. Someone had been there, and whoever they were, they had never left. It was late September when I found the cabin. I hadn't been looking for it. I had been hiking through the woods in northern Montana, trying to clear my head. The summer had been rough. Work was getting worse, my dad's health was failing, and my girlfriend had walked out on me without saying much. I just needed some time away, a few days alone in the woods where I could pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. I packed light, just enough food for 3 days, a tent, a sleeping bag, and my rifle in case I ran into a bear. I wasn't an experienced outdoorsman, but I had done enough camping as a kid to know how to take care of myself. The plan was simple: hike deep into the forest, find a good spot, and just exist for a while. By the second day, I was farther from civilization than I had ever been. The trees grew thicker, the trails fainter, and the silence heavier. I had seen deer, a fox, and what I thought was a wolf at one point, but nothing seemed threatening. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful. Then I saw the cabin. It was in a small clearing, surrounded by trees so dense that I almost walked past it. The structure was old, gray, weathered wood with a slanted tin roof that looked like it might cave in with one good storm. The windows were covered with grime, and the front door hung slightly open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Something about it made me stop. I should have kept walking. I should have just ignored it. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, testing the ground as I went. The place looked abandoned, but there were no signs of animals taking over. No claw marks, no nests, no tracks in the dirt outside. Just an eerie stillness that felt out of place. I pushed the door open slowly. The hinges creaked, the sound cutting through the quiet like a knife. Inside, it was dark. The air was thick, stale, with a smell I couldn't place at first, like old wood, damp fabric, and something else, something worse. I hesitated before stepping in. My boots thudded against the wooden floor, kicking up dust that swirled in the slivers of light filtering through the cracks in the walls. There wasn't much inside. A broken chair, a small wooden table, and a shelf with some rusted cans that might have been food once. Then I saw the body. It was slumped against the far wall, half hidden in the shadows. A man, or what was left of him. His clothes were torn, his skin sunken and dry. His face was turned slightly away, but I could see enough. His mouth was open, his eyes hollow and dark. The flesh had started to peel away in places, revealing bone beneath. The smell hit me full force then. Rot, decay, death. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the chair. My stomach twisted, and I had to force myself to breathe through my mouth. I didn't want to look anymore, but I couldn't stop. How long had he been here? My mind raced. He had to have been dead for months, maybe longer. No animals had touched him, which meant the cabin must have kept them out. The cold winters up here might have slowed the decay, but the smell was still thick, clinging to the air like a heavy fog. I tried to piece together what had happened. His clothes looked normal: jeans, a flannel shirt, boots. Not a hiker, though. His build was thick, his hands rough. A local, maybe? A hunter? Someone who had gotten lost? I forced myself to step closer. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my skull. The dust on the floor was undisturbed except for my own tracks, which meant no one had been here in a long time. Then I saw the gun. It was on the floor beside him, the barrel pointing toward his head. A revolver, old, rusted. I didn't need to check if it had been fired. I already knew.
Suicide.
It had to be. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. The pieces fit together now. A man, alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. A gun. No signs of a struggle, no other footprints. No one had come looking for him. I felt a strange sense of sadness then. Whoever he was, he had chosen to die here, in this forgotten place. I turned away, stepping back toward the door. My hands felt clammy, my legs shaky. I needed to leave now. But then I noticed something else. On the table next to the rusted cans was a notebook. Its cover was worn, the pages yellowed. It had been left open, the last entry visible in scrawled handwriting. I shouldn't have read it, but I did. The words were shaky, uneven, as if written by a man whose strength was failing. Asterisk, I hear them at night, scratching at the walls, watching from the trees. I thought I was alone out here, but I was wrong. They don't come inside. Not yet, but I don't think I can last much longer. If anyone finds this, leave. Don't stay. Don't let them see you. Asterisk, my skin crawled. I looked around the cabin again, suddenly feeling exposed. The walls, the windows, the door, it all felt too open, too vulnerable. I grabbed my pack and backed out of the cabin, my breath coming fast. The air outside felt colder now, the trees darker. I didn't look back as I started walking.
Ivalkiet fast.
Then I ran. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until my lungs burned and my legs ached. I camped that night with my rifle close, every sound in the forest setting me on edge. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I hiked straight back to my truck. I told myself it was just a man who had lost his mind out there, alone for too long. Isolation does strange things to people. The scratching sounds he wrote about, the feeling of being watched, it was probably just paranoia. The woods can make you feel like that, but part of me didn't believe it. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. I had never been one for the wilderness. Sure, I had gone on a few camping trips as a kid, but that was always in designated campgrounds with well-marked trails, fire pits, and a handful of other families scattered around. Being truly alone in the woods had never appealed to me. But life has a way of forcing you into situations you never expected. In 2018, after a messy breakup and a job that was sucking the life out of me, I needed a reset. My uncle owned a small hunting cabin in northern Montana, not too far from the Canadian border. It was old, built sometime in the late 60s, and hadn't been used much in the past few years. He told me I could use it for as long as I wanted if I didn't mind doing a little maintenance. It sounded perfect at the time. Just me, some fresh air, and no distractions. The drive up took longer than expected. The roads got worse the further north I went, turning from smooth asphalt to patchy gravel, then finally to a narrow dirt trail cutting through the thick forest. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour when I finally spotted the turnoff. The cabin was tucked about a quarter mile off the road, hidden behind a thick patch of pines. It was smaller than I had imagined, with a sagging front porch and weathered with siding that had turned gray from years of exposure. The roof looked solid, and the door was still locked when I arrived, so at least I knew no one had broken in. The inside was exactly what I expected. Simple, bare bones, and a little musty. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, along with a rickety old table and a few mismatched chairs. There was no running water, just a hand pump outside, and the only electricity came from a small generator out back. I unpacked my things, set up a cot near the stove, and cracked open a beer, feeling like I had made the right decision. That feeling didn't last long. The first night was fine, a little eerie, but I chalked it up to being alone in the woods. Every little sound seemed amplified, the rustling of leaves, the creak of the old wood, the occasional snap of a branch outside. But nothing truly felt wrong. That changed on the second night. I had spent the day chopping firewood and patching up a few holes in the walls. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, I was exhausted. I made a simple meal, read for a bit by the weak glow of my flashlight, then turned in early. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, and the cabin was cold. I pulled my blanket tighter around me and listened. The woods were silent. That alone felt strange. There was always noise at night. Crickets whined through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. But now, nothing. It was the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate sound coming from outside. Footsteps. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. A deer maybe, or a bear sniffing around. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't an animal. The steps were slow and measured, circling the cabin. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the small space around me. The front door was still shut. The windows were intact. Then something tapped against the wall. 3 sharp knocks, right near the door. I froze. My first instinct was to call out to ask who was there, but something in the back of my mind told me not to. Instead, I grabbed the small hatchet I had left near the stove and crept toward the window. The glass was dirty and warped, making it hard to see outside. But in the dim moonlight, I could make out the trees and the clearing in front of the cabin. Nothing moved. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, standing there in the dark for what felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A figure. It stood just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just a tall, unmoving shape. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of the cabin, hatchet in hand, staring at the door. By morning, the figure was gone. I stepped outside, scanning the treeline. There were no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to indicate someone had been there. But I knew what I had seen. I should have left then. I should have packed my things and driven away without looking back. But I didn't. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. That night, I locked the door, barricaded it with a chair, and kept my hatchet within reach. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound. Around 3 a.m., something heavy pressed against the cabin wall. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound of slow, dragging footsteps moved along the porch. Then, a single knock. It wasn't frantic or aggressive, just one slow, deliberate knock. I stayed frozen until dawn. When the first light crept through the trees, I finally forced myself to move. I packed my things in record time, not bothering to clean up or put anything away. I needed to get out. The drive back felt longer. The dirt road seemed rougher, the trees more suffocating. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. I never went back. A few weeks later, my uncle called. He asked how the trip had gone, if I had gotten any work done on the cabin. I told him it was fine, but I had decided I wasn't much of a woodsman. He chuckled and then said something that made my stomach drop. Yeah, figured as much. That place always gave me the creeps. My dad used to say someone was living out there way back in the day. Some old hermit or something. Probably just stories, though. I didn't respond. I didn't want to know more. I never told him what I saw. I had never liked being out in the woods alone. Not because I was scared of the dark or the idea of being by myself, but because there was always that lingering feeling that something could go wrong, and there'd be no one around to help. That thought had been with me ever since I was a kid, and it had only gotten stronger over the years. But when my cousin Paul asked me to help him check on an old hunting cabin his father had built decades ago, I couldn't say no. It was supposed to be a quick trip. Drive up, make sure everything was still standing, maybe fix a few things, and head back home before dark. It didn't go that way. The cabin was deep in the woods, about an hour from the nearest town, and a good 20 minutes from the closest dirt road. It was the kind of place you only went if you had a reason. The last time I had been there was years ago, back when Paul's father was still alive. I remembered the place being small but sturdy, with a single room, a wood-burning stove, and a little loft where they used to keep supplies. It wasn't anything fancy, just a place for hunters to crash for the night. Paul couldn't make the trip at the last minute, some emergency at work, so I figured I'd just go alone. It wasn't like I had anything else planned that weekend, and I figured it would be nice to get away from everything for a bit. I brought my truck, packed a few basic tools, some food, and my rifle just in case. I wasn't planning on hunting, but you never knew what you might run into out there. The drive was uneventful, just miles of empty roads cutting through thick forests. When I finally reached the dirt path leading to the cabin, I could already tell the place had been abandoned for a while. The road was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and branches, like nature had been trying to erase it. I had to drive slow to avoid tearing up my tires on hidden rocks and tree roots. When I got to the clearing where the cabin stood, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. That should have been my first warning, but I figured it was just the time of day or the weather. The sky was overcast, the air thick with humidity, making everything feel still. The cabin looked about how I remembered it: weathered wood, a sagging roof, and a porch that had seen better days. The door was shut, but the lock had rusted so badly that it barely held together. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. Damp wood, old dust, and something else. Something faint but unpleasant, like spoiled meat. I told myself it was just an old animal nest or maybe some food that had been left behind and gone bad. The inside was exactly as I expected. Crude wooden furniture, a few shelves stocked with rusted cans, and a thin layer of dirt covering everything. There were footprints on the floor, though, not mine. The dust should have settled over the years, but there were tracks, leading from the door to the far corner where an old cot sat against the wall. Someone had been here. I checked around, looking for signs of squatters or animals. The footprints were the only thing out of place. No personal belongings, no signs of a fire, nothing that suggested someone had been living there. Just those tracks. I figured it was just some drifter passing through, maybe a hunter taking shelter from the rain. Still, the whole place made me uneasy. I spent the next couple of hours checking the structure, making sure the roof wasn't about to collapse and the walls weren't rotting through. The more I worked, the more that uneasy feeling sat in my gut. It wasn't just the footprints. It was the silence, the smell, the way the trees seemed too close, like they were pressing in on the cabin. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. I was about to head back outside when I noticed something on the wall near the cot. Scratches. Deep, uneven grooves like someone had dragged a knife or a claw against the wood. They weren't random either. They formed letters, words. Leave now. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They looked old, like they had been carved in years ago, but they were too deliberate to ignore. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough edges. The cuts were deep, almost angry. That was the moment I should have left. But I didn't. I told myself it was just some joke, maybe something Paul's father had done to mess with the guys who stayed here. It didn't mean anything. I finished up my checks, made a few minor repairs, and figured I'd stay the night. It was late, and I didn't want to drive back through the woods in the dark. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot, ate a quick meal, and settled in for the night. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal, but then I heard it again, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps were heavy, not like an animal, but not quite human either. They didn't shuffle or pause like someone trying to find their way. They just circled over and over again. I reached for my rifle, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. The footsteps stopped, right outside the door. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the handle moved. Not fast, not like someone trying to break in. Just a slow, testing turn. I held my breath, gripping the rifle so tight my hands ached. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat there, listening to the silence, waiting for the footsteps to return. They never did. At first light, I packed my things and got out of there. I didn't bother locking the door. I didn't care anymore. As I drove away, I looked back once, just for a second. There was someone standing at the tree line, not moving, not following, just standing there watching. I never went back. I had never been the kind of person who's scared easily. Growing up in the countryside, surrounded by dense woods and empty fields, I had spent plenty of nights alone, listening to the sounds of nature while the rest of the world slept. I always told myself that fear was something you let in, something you had to allow before it could take hold of you. That belief stayed with me for years, even after I inherited my grandfather's old farm. The land had been in the family for decades, passed down from one generation to the next. When my father decided he wanted nothing to do with it, I was the one who took it over. It wasn't much. A few acres of overgrown pasture, a barn that had seen better days, and a small cabin that had once been my grandfather's home. The cabin was nothing special. A single-story wooden structure with a tin roof, a wood-burning stove, and enough space to make do. It sat at the back of the property, hidden from the main road by a line of thick trees. I moved in during the fall of 2015. I was 32 at the time, coming off a bad breakup and looking for a fresh start. The farm was isolated, far from town, and I figured the quiet would do me some good. I planned to fix up the place, maybe even turn it into something profitable. But from the moment I arrived, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious. There were no strange noises, no sudden feelings of dread. It was just a general unease, a sense that something wasn't quite right. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was getting used to being alone in a place I hadn't set foot in since I was a kid. But then things started happening. At first, it was small things, tools going missing, doors I swore I had closed being found open. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. Living alone in an old cabin, it was easy to lose track of things. Then I started noticing footprints in the dirt outside my door. They weren't mine. They were large, deep impressions in the soil, as if something heavy had been walking around my cabin in the middle of the night. They led from the treeline to my porch and then disappeared back into the woods. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a bear, but the prints were too human, too deliberate. One night I heard something outside. It was past midnight, and I had been sitting in my chair, reading by the light of an old lantern. The sound was soft at first, barely noticeable over the wind. A slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. I stood up, my heart pounding. The sound stopped. I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The porch light cast a weak glow, barely reaching the edge of the trees. I saw nothing, but I felt something, presence, a weight in the air that made my skin crawl. I locked the door. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Every gust of wind made me tense. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few weeks, the feeling of being watched never went away. No matter where I was, outside working, inside cooking, even lying in bed, I felt eyes on me. I started keeping my rifle by the door. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was outside the cabin, low and steady, just beyond the wall near my bed. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there listening. The breathing continued for what felt like hours. Slow, rhythmic, like someone standing just inches away from me, separated only by a thin wall of wood. Then it stopped. I stayed awake until dawn. When I finally got up the courage to go outside, I saw them. Footprints. Not just a few, but dozens of them. They surrounded the cabin, circling it again and again, overlapping each other like a tangled mess of movement. Whoever or whatever had been out there had been walking around my home for hours. I started sleeping with the rifle in my hands. Days passed. I barely ate, barely slept. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Then came the night everything changed. It was just after midnight. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows. I had locked the doors, barred them with a wooden plank. I sat in the dark, the rifle across my lap, waiting. Then I heard it. A knock. Not loud, not forceful. Just a slow, deliberate tap against the wood. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. The knocking stopped. Then footsteps. Slow, shuffling footsteps moving along the porch. I raised the rifle, aiming toward the door. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then the doorknob turned. Not violently, not like someone trying to break in. Just a slow, testing turn, as if whoever was on the other side wanted to see if it was unlocked. I aimed at the door. My finger tightened on the trigger. Then a voice. Not a human voice. Not words. Just a low, guttural sound. Something between a growl and a whisper. I fired. The shot echoed through the night, deafening in the small cabin. The doorknob stopped turning. The footsteps retreated. Then silence. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just sat there waiting for the sun to rise. When it did, I stepped outside. The porch was empty. No blood, no body. Just footprints. But they weren't normal. They started as human. But as they moved away from the cabin, they changed. The further they got, the less human they became. By the time they reached the treeline, they were something else entirely. Something with claws. That was the last night I stayed at the farm. By noon, I had packed what little I owned into my truck. I didn't care about the cabin, the land, the family history. I just wanted to be gone. I never went back. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if whoever or whatever was outside my cabin that night is still there, waiting. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked the door, or if I had opened it.